let me start over. There's a varying levels of concern, confusion, consternation about Russia's route and trend on the road to democracy, as we call it, at least as we think of it. There are those who tell us that Russians have always liked a centrally important economy, and that they prefer a somewhat more authoritarian model than the one that we're used to in this country. We hear other voices that take a very different point of view, including within Russia. I'd be interested in what you think the trends are, how the majority of the Russian people feel about the level of democracy they have. On the economic front, it's hard to believe, but when Fred and I were in the Nixon administration, we worked hard on developing economic relations with the Soviet Union, and I'll never forget having looked at 35 product categories and finding that the Soviet Union could only compete with the rest of the world in one of them. And all of their exports in the other 34 were to the Comecon countries that they had control over. I'd be interested in what the current status is in your non-oil sector, in your manufacturing sectors, in terms of relative productivity, relative competitiveness with the rest of the world. So, Mr. Friedman, do you want to answer those simple questions?
Thank you. First of all, Peter asked me to answer more dangerous questions, so I will start from political issue, if it's possible. I obviously understand concern which Americans and Europeans expressed many times about democratical process in Russia. And it will be maybe not very fair to say that we have the same level of democracy as you guys have here in the United States or in Western European countries. I would say that, of course, democracy in Russia is very new historical phenomenon. It just took place since beginning of 90s, and first was introduced as pretty wild and bad regulated form. I would say that if you're looking for that from historical point of view, it's a very short period of time which gave to Russian, to many Russian, to millions of Russians, a lot of fruit from, let's say, democratic tree. As Peter already mentioned, millions of Russians could travel abroad. Millions of Russians started to invest their own money and own their, businesses, property, houses, cars, so on and so forth. So I would say, compares to time which all this process took place, I would say that democratical changes are very serious. Compares to achievement which European and American society made within hundreds of years is just the beginning of the road. And that's no doubt. It was a lot of requests from the population in the beginning of 2000s to establish more strict rules, to establish more strict regulation, to manage more, I would say, toughly all sphere of social life in Russia. And from that point, Mr. Putin just responded to that challenge, appropriately as a national leader. On the other hand, I am convinced that the agenda of the next national leader, who might be Mr. Medvedev as a newly elected president, will be to go forward with a more democratical agenda. That will be an inevitable condition to achieve that economical goal which Peter described in his lecture. And actually, I'm very happy that it was already announced in his first speeches, inaugurational speeches, which I think very symbolical issue. Answer your question, whether we're satisfied with the level of democracy, I would say no. Whether we're satisfied with that level in the context of history of Russia, I would say that probably almost maximum we could achieve.
And how would you say if we were to do a secret public opinion study in Russia, and you ask them the question, there have been some changes in recent years that it strikes me at least toward more centralization, not more democracy. How do you feel about the current state of democracy in Russia? What do you think the population as a whole would say?
I would say the answer will be maybe a little bit disappointing for many Western years. That I think that generally people will be more or less satisfied with the level of democracy. It will be not like crucial negative reaction for that question. Why it's happened? Not because that's really so good situation with that, but because to make assessment with level of democracy, people should understand what does it mean. But if you analyze the whole history of life of Soviet people, it's very hard to have a benchmark. So within the whole history of Soviet Union, level of democracy will be by far lower. When it was period of chaos and misunderstanding what's going on with economical life, what's the rule of the game, have to retain your salary, have to retain your job, have to feed your family. So after all that period, after all that disaster which took place, current level of democracy, from the point of view of simple Russian, is pretty high. We could travel, we could make an investment, we could own, we could actually vote somehow, and frankly, to value properly what you lose, you should previously own that. If we never own real democratic rights, if we never feel as a citizen that we could vote and really impact, internal or external policy, it's very hard to say we lost something. We didn't lose too much compared to Soviet time. I'm sure that the new generation, which by the way Mr. Medvedev represents right now, looking for that little bit different eye. Why? Because we're fortunate to travel. We've seen how it works in other countries. We, more open to the world, internet, so on and so forth. So that's make me hope that within nearest period of history of Russia, that movement to more democratic, more liberal society will be inevitable.
Peter, do you want to say something about your competitiveness in the non-oil sector, productivity, and so forth with the rest of the world?
I guess it stayed more or less on the same level in the Soviet Union. Russians, if you see on high tech, I think it went down, not up. More or less, Russia started to export more machinery. That's official statistic tells us, but it's only armaments, which is also not the newest examples. And in fact, I believe that this competitiveness can come from small and medium-sized business, first of all, not from big state enterprises. But today in Russia, small and medium-sized business share export is 2% of GDP only. So in China it's 60%. So they try to find their niche and they try to be competitive, not in Russia. So that's the institutional problem. So I think that today Russia again will be the same answer. Competition is not definitely not went up.
Another question that fascinates America is what Mr. Putin's role is going to be in the future. 2 years from now, 5 years from now. There are some in America who believe that this prime minister arrangement is just an interim way of his assuming power. I've heard other points of view. So if you had to make a prediction 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, what will Putin's role be? Greater than it is now? About the same? Less? Or what? Incidentally, if you get in trouble in Russia for answering this question, I would be glad to house you here at the Institute.
Thank you, Peter. I am afraid that I'm not in trouble to answer the question because of certain, fears or threats, but because of lack of understanding what's going on within 2 or 3 years from now. My suggestion is following. On one hand, if you analyze the whole history of Russia, it's not very typical for the Russian history to model of sharing of power. So my suggestion that in the end of the day, Russia is the country with a tradition of pretty centralized power. That's one, let's say, statement. The other statement, Mr. Putin is extremely popular as a political leader, and he made a lot of contribution to fast growth of personal incomes, and because it's, of course, the main factor for, assessment of the activity of the politician in Russia, at least right now, I think he is very strong, popular, and sustainable popular politician in the country, most sustainable popular politician in the country. To predict precisely how will develop a relation between Mr. Medvedev and Mr. Putin is pretty hard. It depends of a lot of factors. I mean, ideal picture that we will share power, and Mr. Medvedev will be responsible for some part of the issue, Mr. Putin will be responsible for the other part of the issue. Frankly, it seems to me it's not easy to achieve. So it's difficult, and besides that, it will be very severely depend on the economical situation in the country, internal and external political challenges they will have, so on. So I'm afraid that to make, for the time being, final answer will be not dangerous but unfair. My suggestion that it will be a much more clear situation within a pretty short period of time. I anticipate that within 9 to 12 months from now, we will have by far more clear understanding what will be distribution of power among them two. What is the good news? I mean, it's a very difficult job to split power. What is the good news? That, of course, personal relation between them is pretty, I would say, strong and sincere, because they know each other within a long period of time. So hopefully that painful process will go rather smoothly. But I think that more seriously to talk about that, I would say in the end of current year.
Would you like to say something? Well, go ahead.
First of all, let me correct an egregious absence of a comment in my initial remarks. I mentioned we're launching this big Russia balance sheet project with our friends at CSIS and also with our friends at the U.S.-Russia Business Council, which I failed to mention. I should include that. They're a very important part of the group. I wanted to follow up a question to Peter, because I thought you said a stunning thing a moment ago, namely that the competitiveness of Russia outside the oil sector was no greater than the competitiveness of the old Soviet Union. If that's correct, it suggests to me that most of the progress you pointed to in your remarks does derive from the higher price for oil. And so then the question is, suppose the oil price collapses again, as it has once every 10 years for the last several decades, what's the threshold? How far would the oil price have to drop to really create a new disaster for the economy of Russia?
That's what we call a softball question in the United States.
Well, that's one thing. One is disaster for the economy, another is a disaster for expectations. You know that people to be disappointed if the real income are growing 10% a year. I guess if they start to grow 2% a year, it will be already a disaster. It will be a very difficult political issue to whoever is there. And so that we can obtain even if oil goes to $70, $60, $70 a barrel. So it's not too much. If you exclude this psychological thing, that Russia will be able to survive more or less with $30 a barrel, definitely. But again, that's a question which has no answer, because we don't know what they are planning to do, what the strategy. For me, high oil price is not a good thing. On one hand, it's a good thing because it gives prosperity. From the other hand, they definitely postpone reforms. And so what will be their reaction, what they will do, that will be the question. Well, the country, when we were buying 10 KBP, the price was $9 a barrel or $10 a barrel. 15, 12 was the maximum. And the country was somehow surviving. So that's not a question of catastrophe. There will be no catastrophe if that's proper economic policy. What will be the direction? With the price below 60, I guess there will fast and crucial reforms will be inevitable. That will be my answer.
Yeah, I would like to add a bit. First of all, I think that this was an excellent presentation because Peter brought forward here, on the one hand, how strong the growth and how strong the macroeconomic performance is. It's truly impressive. On the other hand, the last slides showing in the last 5 years there have been no reforms. Russia is outgrowing the suit. You can't continue like this, not developing infrastructure, with the state extending itself. And what naturally comes out of your presentation here, it is that something must happen. And the lower the oil price, the sooner something will happen. And we would also assume here the worse it gets, the more power with Medvedev, because he's not responsible for not having done something. What he told us yesterday was he attacked legal nihilism and corruption. These were the two key points in his presentation, while Putin was left saying that he had always worked honestly and openly, which is of course not quite true, at least not openly. And the suggestion here is really that the lower the oil price, the more reforms, the more democracy, the better for Russia. Would you react to that?
Well, of course, we discussed that yesterday with Jim Harman, and he pointed out that no government is good without the crisis. That the government starts to react only when the serious crisis is there. Without serious crisis in Soviet economy, there would be no reforms of Yeltsin and no reforms of Gaidar, in which I took place, fortunately for me. So that's the same story now. At the same time, certain level of crisis is very dangerous because it destroys everything. So that's also a controversial issue. I agree with others completely that a very high oil price postpones the reforms and makes it more difficult to implement. And this consumption boom, I guess, is mentally destroying for the country. That's, in principle, that's not good, but continues too long. So, but at the same time, if oil price dramatically collapse, it may raise very, very serious social and different issues. So that's a question of balance, I think. I would agree that I would like to see oil prices not at the level of 120, definitely, but on certain level which will guarantee reforms, but not destroy the rest.
Brad, do you have any?
No, I just like to add that, it's very easy to criticize government and authority. It's, pleasant and nice job, but and for me as well, and which I'm doing regularly. but on the other hand, what I would like to admit that if you're looking for the history of last 20 years in the country, of course, on one hand, it is obligation of the government to use the chance if the price for oil is so high to utilize this advantage and to make some real deep structural reform. On the other hand, as far as we understand, any reform, especially in a country like Russia, which is not at all prepared for, let's say, pure capitalism, pure capitalistic type of relation, was not prepared, in the beginning. Very painful. So on one hand, for instance, for Mr. Putin was to provide that reform decisively. On the other hand, to make some break after many years of chaos and disaster and losing savings, so on and so forth. As a normal politician, he always preferred to have more stable and sustainable situation. Politicians in each country, it seems to me, living permanently from election to election. That's maybe bad, but that's the rule of the game. So it's hard to accuse him in that decision. Because, of course, to take responsibility and to start reform within that period of time, maybe long-term will be more efficient for the country, but on the other hand, psychologically difficult for the population, which started to breathe, quietly after, pretty difficult period of our history.
Yeah, I was going to ask one on agriculture, and then we'll open it up to the rest of you. I'm way out of date on this, gentlemen, but in the 70s, I was struck by the fact that in your agriculture sector, your productivity was about 9% of ours, in spite of heavy capital investment in equipment and so forth. And when I tried to figure out why, on the way down to a meeting with your friend Mr. Brezhnev, I noticed a bunch of farm equipment just standing idly in the fields. And some minister was sitting next to me drinking vodkas at a very impressive rate. I figured it'd be a good time to get the truth. I asked him to explain to me how he could explain investing all this and having so little productivity. Well, he explained it to me in the following ways. He said, well, I've been to Iowa, and I noticed several things. First, the farmers here have no particular incentive because they don't own the land. Secondly, the ministry that plans the production of equipment is different than the one planning the parts. There's no dealer organization, and therefore no one much cares about this equipment. The distribution system had about 25% of the farm just rotting in the fields. What's happened in agriculture, because this is closely tied to communist policy on owning land and so forth?
Well, in agriculture is mainly nothing good. Land reform de facto didn't take place, and the old famous Soviet slogan, "the country has to feed its farmers," is basically still there. No, that's agriculture. It's a joke, of course. It was a slogan. It was the slogan used on some demonstration of some agriculture trade unions. No, in the beginning of '90s. But anyway, agriculture is definitely going down because of huge. That's all input substitution, de facto. That's a new private agriculture. Did take surface somewhere on a very limited scale, but mainly you go outside Moscow, far and far, you go and see that villages are dying, people are leaving, and so that's in agriculture there's no progress. To be frank, again, taking Russian history, Russian agriculture never was comparably efficient to the Western agriculture. If you compare 1913, Russian labor productivity in agriculture was 7 times lower than in France. So it was never competitive. It was changed in the beginning of 20s somehow, but it was very old-fashioned. Today, agriculture is definitely one of the sectors which is absolutely huge social and productivity problem. Nothing good.
Questions from the audience, please. Yes, sir.